Welcome everyone. Before I get Chapter 9's video on photography uploaded here into announcements, I wanted to take a moment to address the document that I uploaded this afternoon into files here on the left. The top document here is the revised syllabus. Now this is just giving you an update on the rest of the semester week by week. Mainly the changes are occurring in the calendar. So if you go to the last page, we have March the 13th when we started the no face-to-face classes, and it's just giving you a breakdown week by week of what we're going over in the course. You have the video lectures being uploaded to Canvas, and also any extra credit assignments, as well as the dates that are important to remember. The new last day to withdraw from the course with a W is April the 17th. And then May the 11th, the last day of the class, which is when your research papers and research presentations are due by. You can feel free to send me those at any point from now until then. Just attach your Word document or your PowerPoint document to an email and send those over to me. You've also got information about the final exam, which will be on the originally scheduled date, which is Friday, May the 15th, and that will be online. So if we close out of this and go back to the Files tab, you have your final study guide, which is all the vocabulary that we're going over, as well as the final review PowerPoint, which I will also make a video for and post with a link. This lectures folder is what we've been going over. You can see chapters 7 and 8 that we finished with, and what we're going over today, which is chapter 9 on photography and film. Just make sure that if you want these for study purposes, that you download them now, because I'm not going to be able to fit the last three chapters, 11, 12, and 13, onto Canvas without deleting these. So I'll leave them up for another week, and then I will delete them and upload the new PowerPoint presentations. So if we click this and open up photography and film, it will take us to the chapter that we're going to begin today. So to discuss photography, we have to discuss the camera, right? It is what you use, the tool, to take a picture. And what are we doing when we take a picture? We are capturing the way that the light looks as it bounces off the subject, whatever that subject might be that you're pointing your camera at. Regardless of if it's a digital camera on a phone or a tablet, or any of you that have used the classic form of the camera that uses a film to capture that light onto. They work the same way. They have a lens on the front, and you point that at your subject and hit the button, and it opens the aperture, the little hole in the front, briefly allows light to pass through, and that then generates the photograph that we are looking at. So where does light come from? We all know that light comes from the sun. Even if you have an artificial light source, you're still using energy that was at one point produced by our celestial solar body, the sun. We've talked about earlier in the semester in chapter 4 in the visual elements, when we talked about light, the study of Isaac Newton passing white light from the sun through a prism that then breaks that light down into its component parts, its frequencies that give us the colors that we know as the rainbow. And we talked about how the longer ones produce red. As you get shorter, you get towards the other end of the spectrum, blue and violet. But we also discussed how that visible spectrum of light that is the rainbow colors is only about 2% of all of the electromagnetic spectrums that are out there, some of which are being produced by the sun right now. But we also know now, with the study of physics, that even though light acts like a wave in that it has different wavelengths, they are still composed of individual particles, that being the photon. So, how does a camera function? It's just like your eye when we think about it. Think about the diagram that we looked at also in the chapter on light in chapter 4, about how your eye has a small hole on the front, much like a camera does, your pupil, and then on the back of your eye you have a retina with 3 types of rod and cone cells that those photons go in and make a rendering of the outside world that your brain then perceives as your sight. So the camera functions very much like the eye does. We have a small hole, and then on the back of the eye we're transferring the image to our brain. The same way the very earliest camera does, the camera obscura. So the same as your eye, very small hole on the front, and then on the inside of this dark box, much like your eyeball, the artist stands. And in this case, we have a simple subject, the tree. They're standing on the inside here where you have a dark space and are transferring that image, tracing it. Now, you might have seen a camera obscura before. The last time I made one was a few years ago, although I had done this in elementary school, as you may have. But we had a partial solar eclipse, and I made one with a cereal box. Popped a little pinhole in one side, and then in the other side of the cereal box, cut a hole so that I would point the pinhole towards the sun behind me, and then look down into the bottom of the dark box and see the eclipse reflected onto that surface. And what I thought was really astounding, and I didn't notice this in elementary school, was that there was color. It wasn't just the outline of the sun and the part that was eclipsed. I was actually seeing clouds and blue sky reflected onto the bottom of that dark room. So the camera obscura comes around in the Renaissance period, but this phenomenon has been observed for at least 1,000 years and written about. See this in ancient Chinese writing. Think about how easy it would be for this to happen. If you had a hole in the curtain in your room and you were sitting in there in the dark, you might see the outside world being reflected on a wall on the other side of the room from that tiny little hole. Seeing maybe the clouds going by, trees blowing. But this is something that advances after it becomes popular in the Renaissance. As we can see with a print here with the deluxe model of the camera obscura, you've got, instead of just one side that has a hole in it and is bringing the image into the artist, with this model that they've made an engraving onto a copper plate so this could be printed and shared around Europe, you've got this camera obscura that would have 4 holes, one on each side of this box. And then the artist would stand on the interior here, and this would be a framework with vellum. So you've got a translucent paper, much like tracing paper today. Vellum could have been hung here, and then when the light comes in, you would get a reflection of this scene, albeit inverted, as happens when you pass that light through the small hole. But the artist could take this rendering then, go back to the studio, and have a perfect tracing of that 360-degree view of the surrounding countryside. So this is the principle that we get the original form of the camera. And this is what evolves into the digital cameras that we use now on our modern devices. But originally, just like the camera obscura, you have a hole on the front, an aperture that is adjustable, so the brighter it is outside, the smaller that needs to be, just like your pupil. On a bright day, it shrinks. On a very dark evening, it's going to be expanded to let more light in. And then on the back, just like your retina in your eye or the drawing surface in the camera obscura, a film would have been loaded into the rear portion of the camera. So, film we will talk about later in this section, but it is a light sensitive emulsion. It is a surface that when the light comes through and is projected onto it, it is able to record that state of the light outside onto that surface. So the first form of the camera that we see comes in the early 1800s from Joseph Nicephore Niepce. He's a Frenchman. You see in his piece here, in the heliograph in 1825, his first rendering that it is a photograph, but it's not very great quality. It's very grainy, nondescript. You can maybe make out what's going on in the piece. You have some rooftops, some architectural structures, the sides of buildings, but what could you expect from a camera that looks like this? You have a wooden box that has a hole in the front of it, much like your eye and the camera obscura. So it's like a miniature camera obscura. You had the light sensitive emulsion, in this case silver iodide, on a nickel plate, and then the light would come in and make a chemical reaction on that metal plate. So we're not even using film yet. This is a treatment that would be chemically placed onto that piece of metal and then exposed to light. And with this process, he was having to make this exposure for the better part of the day. He calls it a heliograph from the sun, and it is exposed. He points this out the window and just leaves it there. Comes back at the end of the day and takes it out and has your one-off image. So we're not able to make copies. This is just making one single version of that print. But how could you even use this photograph? I mean, you know what happens over the course of the day. The sun changes its direction, shadows shift, clouds change the light, and there is just the result is just very low quality. So this advances as we proceed in the 1800s with Louis Jacques Daguerre and the daguerreotype. In the 1840s, he has come up with his own process, and this is very similar to the process that Niepce was using. It's the same emulsion, silver iodide, placed in this case on a copper sheet. So, same deal. You've got a wooden camera that is a camera obscura. It's a dark box, and then it has on the back of it the area where you will load in your copper plate that's treated with silver iodide. This would then be closed, and then on the front, it's got a little bit more of a innovation here on the lens on the front of the camera, but the same principle. You have a hole that's letting the light in and expose this copper plate to light. So it does work a lot better, as we see with his photographs. Much more detail, as well as a minimized time for exposure. And he gets this down to under a minute in the final stages, albeit he's starting with a form that he's still having to expose for half an hour. But he perfects this, the formula, and he can make these images, but they're still just one-offs. Unless you waited for the exact same time the next day to be able to make this photograph, you would not be able to make two of them. But that would be the way that you could get something close. It's not for a while that we get to the point where we can copy the exact same form of the image. This is one of his photographs that I think is pretty incredible because it is the first recorded person that is been captured by a photograph, even though it's one created on a metal plate here. This person stayed still long enough while he was getting his shoe shined here to actually be captured in this photograph. This would have been a busy street. People were walking, carriages were moving by, but none of those were captured because they didn't stay still. So with an exposure process like that, you had to make sure your subjects were posing. Enter William Henry Fox Talbot with the calotype. So this is the paper negative. We're still not using film yet. We're still using, in this case, a light sensitive emulsion that has been used to treat this paper. And what Talbot comes up with a way to do is start to make copies of photographs. So you've got an image that you can capture, but that you can also recreate and make many more of. In this case, using a paper negative. So the original photograph is going to be exposed and it will look like this. And when you shine light through this over the top of another piece of light sensitive emulsion treated paper, you will get this transfer. So you can see what's happening. Where it is dark, it is not letting a lot of light pass through, and you're getting a lighter exposure. Where it's light, you have a lot of light passing through, and you get a much darker exposure. So your different grayscale light to dark values that can pass from this paper onto the paper below. And that's still the way that you would develop film and transfer negatives today, but just on celluloid film, which we'll talk about here in a moment. Talbot wasn't originally trying to make this process to copy photographs. He thought it was a really cool way that he could treat paper with light sensitive emulsion and then place objects on the top of it. He was a botanist. He had a lot of documentation of various species, and this was one of the ways that he found that would be useful with this process. Instead of making a negative and then transferring a copy of a photo, he would take one of his samples from the field. In this case, well, it's an unnoted botanical species. Maybe you know which species it is, but place that over the top of the paper, shine light on it, and then what would happen is you get an exact copy of the plant specimen on this piece of paper. And you can see with plant matter, in the case of these leaves, it is translucent. The light passes through it, so photosynthesis can occur, but you can even see the structure, all the veins in the leaves themselves, and it's a really effective way at taking those samples. Instead of going through and sketching them and then maybe making a print so that you can put it in your publication, you've just got an exact copy of it on this paper. The only issue with a paper negative was that the quality of the image was not as crisp as it could be if you were just transferring through a lens onto the surface that you were creating that negative out of. And with paper, you are working with a substance that is by nature grainy. It has wood grain in its fiber. But if you use glass, in the case of the collodion process that we have here, you get a much more detailed image. So these negatives were arguably much more durable than the paper negatives of the calotype. They would not start to wear and tear after being exposed many, many times and making copies. But the glass of the collodion process also has its own negative features in that we all know what happens to glass if it is impacted. It breaks and then would destroy that original negative. But these were some of the examples we have coming from the 1800s and this one coming from 1867, Julia Margaret Cameron and her use of the collodion glass negative. This one definitely not as focused as they could be, um, but we see a greater quality in the focus whenever we're looking at these photos. This is the first time that people have been photographed, have been had their portrait made at all. Thinking back to centuries prior to this point, if you had your portrait made, it was being made by a painter, and that was a very expensive proposition to enter into, to have your portrait painted. This would have taken a long time. It's not until we get the popularization of the camera that we are even able to see portraiture happen for the everyday citizen at all. So we can see over time what happens to this paper as it's exposed from this glass negative. This is some residue that's coming from the chemical process in developing it. Any of you that have developed photos before in a darkroom, you've got multiple chemical baths that you are running those photographs through. First developing it, and then putting it into a stop bath, and then putting it into your fixative fixer solution. So with these images, we can definitely make a portrait now, but the way that we are having to work is in still life. We're still not able to develop images that are in motion or something that's even moving quickly at all, like you're blinking, like or breathing. The people who were posing for these photographs had to attempt to remain virtually motionless to be able to get the camera to capture them without any movement. So what do we have? We have a tradition, pictorialism, where we are setting up models to pose just like we would centuries before this with painters, having to set someone up to stand there for hours at a time to be able to have this portrait done. So with pictorialism here, we can see this happening. Models that are posed, in this case, the tuberculosis that was moving through the population in that period, the middle of the 1800s, and this little girl here who was being mourned over by her family. Again, the same period. Get to the 1860s, any action that is going to be depicted is going to still be done by a painter. The only photographs that we're going to see are people that were posed and made to stand extremely still for a long period of time. So it's not until we get to George Eastman and the Kodak company that we have the advent of cameras that can be taken out of the field and have very high quality shots taken onto negative and made reproducible for the general public. So here's one of the first models, and as you can see here, we're still operating on the same principle as the camera obscura. We have a wooden box with a hole in the front that has your little lens, and on the back of this box there would be celluloid film. So these are the first cameras that are not using paper or glass to be able to make a negative that you could then copy photographs with. In this case, we are using film, and it's very much the way that a film camera works. If you've used one of those before, you have a knob that you can wind the film with, so advancing the next frame after you've just taken a photograph, and a roll that film is wound onto. And then one other function here, the button that you're using to open the aperture at the front and expose the film. So there you have it, the first point and click camera that was available to the public, and you could really pick one of these up for not that much money. It was affordable. We could buy them. It wasn't something that you had to either be extremely rich or you had to have knowledge of an extensive amount of chemistry to be able to mix your own solutions to be able to develop all these photographs. You could take them somewhere. It started to be available that you could go and develop your photos somewhere at the local pharmacy and then also buy more film for your camera that you purchased for $1. And given that $1 back then at the very end of the 1800s was more than it was today, it was still something that the working citizen could afford. So you can see another ad here for the Brownie camera for $1, and it was really revolutionary. I mean, this was causing people to take pictures of everything. I mean, you wanted to capture those events in life that you didn't want to have to forget. And in this case, the Eastman Kodak Company is doing a really good job at marketing it, putting ads in publications with examples of the quality of picture that it could take. So this was something that you can imagine you were hoping that you would get at some point soon with your earnings. So as time goes on, it only gets more competitive and cheaper. So trying to produce cameras that were even more affordable as time goes on. But this is the beginning of a period that we start to have a revolution in imagery, in that print media, newspapers, and magazines are bringing you images from not just across the United States, but across the world. National Geographic, for example, lots and lots of photography being put on display from around the world with photographers who were in some cases going to locations that were incredibly dangerous. In this case, you've got the first selfie stick. I thought that is useful to throw in there, in that not you're holding the camera on the end of the stick as we do with a modern selfie stick, but using a stick to hit the button on the top of your Brownie camera. One of the most important functions of photography in the 20th century, besides making artistic portraits of people, was photojournalism. And this is a fact that print media witnessed as it took over magazines and newspapers from the end of the 1800s till the present. We absorb most of our media these days online, but photos are still a huge portion of it. When you read an article without having a photograph, we are left to accept the account of the writer as far as the experience that was had. With a photograph, we can travel there, whether it was seeing scenes from World War I on the front lines of battle to events that happened in the 1930s, the Great Depression, the Dust Bowl that hit the agricultural center of the United States. We can witness with photojournalism disparities that occur within society and witness them with all of the intricate details that surround those events or situations. With pure and straight photography, many artists and photographers alike that were photojournalists took this as their mission to examine these disparities and be able to display them with the click of a camera. Sometimes that was not the intention. With pure photography, oftentimes it could just be the tradition of American landscape painting continued into this new media of photography. With the work of Ansel Adams, we definitely see that with his exploration of Yosemite. Or Alvin Langdon Colbert. here, taking a picture of Fifth Avenue in New York before any of the major skyscraper construction took place. This is a very different scene today, but still capturing what was visible at the time perfectly with this tool that was the camera. As far as artists at the time were concerned, they had other ideas for what this technology could be used for. With the Dada movement and surrealism in the early 1900s, we see a use of this light sensitive emotion on paper with the rayograph here by Man Ray, obviously named after himself, the rayogram, but it is virtually a copy of an earlier process that we looked at with the calotype. Just placing objects over the top of the paper and then exposing it to light and making it transfer an image. Looks very similar to the William Henry Fox Talbot calotype here with botanical samples like we looked at earlier, and that's because it's basically the exact same thing, just using a few decades worth of innovation on top. But you can imagine what it would have been like to be an artist in this time period where print media had been overtaken by the image, and instead of like we do with an old magazine just throwing it into hopefully the recycling bin, you could not do that as an artist at this point in time. I mean, there were so many images you never had available before. So we have examples like this, like we looked at the end of the drawing chapter also with collage, where artists will want to cut those images out and then save them for reuse in an artwork, just re-gluing and re-improvising those into a work of their own. These next images are the first color images that we've seen the entire chapter thus far. I always think about black and white images as being the classic photograph as far as the 20th century, or the first half at least, is concerned. But the invention goes back all the way to the 1860s with James Clerk Maxwell here, where we have the original photograph method with three different emulsions, one for blue, one for green, and one for red, that could each negative be overlapped and then a color image derived from those. But it's not until a century later, in the middle of the 20th century, that we see the color photography overtake in print media, as far as being able to deliver that image, or the process of creating that image, to the magazine page. So some various cameras as they exist from Kodak at the time in the 1950s here, and on into the 60s. We really look at photographs in color as normal these days, because all of our images that we are making are produced in this way. But it's not until your generation comes along that we really have the explosion of photography that we have today. And I believe the statistic is somewhere around 800 billion photographs being uploaded to the internet every year. And I'm sure that that number is only going up exponentially as photographs really do take over our entire lives as far as social media is concerned. But this is not possible without the invention of the lowly camera here, which gives birth to another invention, that being film. what you're looking at here is a series of motion pictures taken by Edward Muybridge in 1878, in which a bet was trying to be proved as to whether a horse's feet come off the ground while they are running along. And obviously, you can see that he proved this to be true in some of those photos, but this was something that led to the development of motion picture. In this case, Muybridge was setting up a row of cameras down the racetrack with strings that were attached to their triggers, so that as the horse ran through and broke those strings, the pictures were taken in sequence. But this gave him a great idea that you could take many pictures in sequence like that and run them through a reel and give the perception that something was in motion. So this leads to certain inventions like the kinetoscope by Thomas Edison here, where you have patrons coming and viewing a motion picture or a reel of many photos that were taken in sequence, so that when you looked through the lens, you would see something moving, and it was quite amusing. This was only possible with the invention of celluloid film. So this is the same thing that allows the Brownie camera to develop its photos by winding the film onto a roll. You have a perforated strip along the edge that allows the roller's teeth to grip the film and advance it into the next frame. But in this case, this is what led to the movies. Many pictures taken in sequence that could be displayed in quick succession, so that the persistence of vision made it seem like those objects were in motion. So a motion picture film is what we see whenever we have 24 consecutive frames in a second in front of our eyes. As fast as those display, our brain just translates that into one moving image. So as the celluloid film advances and those frames flash in front of our eyes, we see it as motion. The first film that we really see this happening with, as a film by definition is concerned, is A Trip to the Moon here by George Méliès. And I've put a link in it, so when you download this PowerPoint, you can watch A Trip to the Moon, the very first motion picture, if you want to, but that's up to you. This led to the advent of many businesses popping up all over the place, showing motion pictures, these early movie houses. If you've ever heard the term Nickelodeon, it's not just the Cartoon Network that you probably grew up with. I also watched a lot of Nick whenever I was younger, but the Nickelodeon started as the place that you, if you had a nickel, you could pop it in and be able to see a motion picture. And these would be really short, because if you think about 24 lengths of pictures on that film going through the machine, that was a lot of distance for that film to travel. So like, even if you were watching a film that was a few minutes long, you'd have to have a really massive spool. So we get a little bit better with that technology, and we start to have longer films, being able to come up with machines that can handle really large spools of film running through them, and we start to have movies as we know them today. And directors, or as the chapter talks about, auteurs, French term for, as you can sound it out, it sounds like author. The director is well known. You might like the works of M. Night Shyamalan. Oh no, just kidding. Whoever it might be. In the early half of the 20th century on into the second half, Alfred Hitchcock or Quentin Tarantino. Both of these I love because they're making cameos in their films, as you know, with Tarantino probably. But animation is also something that functions the same way that this motion picture does. If you can take a picture and make a reel of that picture advancing and perceiving to have movement, you can do the same thing with a drawing. So, cartoons were born in this era also. Gertie the Trained Dinosaur being one of the very first in 1914. And I've also got a link to Gertie at the bottom. So if you want to watch Gertie the Trained Dinosaur, you can watch that film also. So this is when we see artists like Walt Disney start to produce a lot of works, animating frame by frame, and then showing those in quick succession so that we end up seeing a motion picture in the form of a cartoon like Mickey Mouse. As technology progresses, we start to figure out different ways to be able to display an object in motion. We're replacing the film strip having images running in quick succession through a machine with technologies like the video camera. In this case, we're not to digital, it's an electronic signal, but it's not the same as filming with your phone when it's converting those pixels into ones and zeros. We're sending an electronic signal through a lens and being able to transfer that into motion on a screen. Those being televisions that are still using a cathode ray tube, which now have almost entirely been replaced by flat screens, LCDs, what have you, LED TVs. Some of you might have still used video technology in that. Some of you might be aware of these VHS tapes using a VCR to be able to play back a signal that was converted electronically and then transferred onto a magnetic strip like we have with VHS tape. That was a novel technology at the time, but those of you that have used them know that if the VCR didn't like that tape and it destroys your magnetic strip that you're running through there, you are no longer in possession of that VHS tape. But we've gotten better to the point where we can take those electronic signals, turn them into ones and zeros, and save them onto hard drives, and be able to then transfer those signals to devices with lenses that are much more powerful, like laser projectors. In the case of our classroom, we have one on the ceiling, and it's capable of projecting these lectures onto a very large screen. And you can control the distance that you are away from the surface that you're projecting onto and make sure that that image is in crisp focus. And this is done with digital technology. Now, I'm going to post a video with your extra credit assignment that will lead you through the history of technology and photography in more detail, and I will put a list of these links up onto Canvas